My name is Solil Ape. I am 31 years old. I want to tell you about the exact weight of a magazine. Not metaphorically, literally, a standard glossy publication, the kind with a thick cover stock, the kind that arrives in a plastic sleeve when it's mailed, the kind that makes a specific sound when you drop it on a table, a sound that is halfway between a slap and a thud, weighs approximately 8 ounces, half a pound, less than a can of soup, less than a decent paperback, less than almost anything you could name that matters. The issue of *Meridian Business magazine that arrived at my parents' house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on a Tuesday morning in March, with my face on the cover and my name in the cover line and 32 pages of story, inside about the company I had built from a spare bedroom and a laptop and a savings account that had once bottomed out at $47. That magazine weighed 8 ounces. My mother has told me since then that she stood at the mailbox for a long time before she picked it up, that she looked at it for what felt like several minutes but was probably 30 seconds, that her hands were shaking when she carried it inside. My father was at the kitchen table when she walked in. He looked up. He saw what she was holding. He said nothing for a very long time. They had spent the previous 4 months telling everyone they knew, neighbors, church members, my father's colleagues at the law firm, my mother's book club, my Aunt Celestine and my Uncle Ray and my cousins in 3 states, that I had moved to Atlanta in disgrace, that I had tried to start a business and failed, that I had been too proud and too stubborn to listen to the people who loved me, and that I was now living quietly in Georgia, licking my wounds, hopefully learning the lesson that ambition without foundation leads to ruin. They had said these things with the particular sadness of parents who have been proven right about a child they love, and that particular sadness had been received by everyone who heard it with the sympathetic nods of a community that understood the tragedy of a promising child who had overreached. The magazine with my face on the cover arrived on a Tuesday, 8 ounces, half a pound. My mother said later that she sat down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, on the floor, and that my father sat down next to her on the kitchen floor and they stayed there for a while. I was not there. I was in Atlanta in the corner office of a company I had built, preparing for a board meeting. I did not know about the magazine arriving until my cousin Patience, 23, the youngest of my Uncle Ray's children, the one who had always had more honesty than tact and who I loved specifically for this, texted me a photograph of my mother sitting on the kitchen floor holding the magazine, taken through the kitchen window with the message, "I think you should know what's happening over here." I looked at that photograph for a very long time. Then I put my phone face down on my desk, and I finished preparing for the board meeting, because that is what I do, that is who I am, and the story of how I became that person is the story I'm going to tell you now. I grew up in Baton Rouge in a house on Magnolia Street that smelled like my mother's cooking and my father's pipe tobacco. He quit when I was 12, but the smell stayed in the walls long after, the particular ghost of a habit that has ended but hasn't quite left, and the specific combination of those 2 smells is still, even now, the smell of home to me in a way that is involuntary and complete. You cannot choose what home smells like. It gets decided in your childhood and lives there permanently, past all the choices you make after. My parents are Chinyere and Obiora Ape. My mother came from Enugu in southeastern Nigeria at 24 to attend Louisiana State University for a graduate degree in library science and met my father, who was finishing his law degree, at a Nigerian Student Association event in 1988. They were married within 18 months, which everyone in both their families considered appropriately deliberate, and which I consider, having watched them for 31 years, to be one of the few genuinely right things about the timeline of my life, that these 2 specific people found each other at that specific moment, because the combination of them is the foundation of everything I am, including the parts of me that have caused all of us the most trouble. My father is a man of tremendous intellectual precision. He became a corporate attorney at a mid-sized Baton Rouge firm and built a reputation, over 30 years, for being the person you called when the problem was genuinely difficult and the margin for error was genuinely zero. He thinks in structures. He builds arguments the way architects build load-bearing walls, every element placed with awareness of what it supports and what supports it. He is not warm in the way that some fathers are warm, not the hug first ask questions later type, but he is present in a way that is more valuable than warmth, the way good infrastructure is more valuable than decoration, reliable load-bearing there. My mother is something different. She is a librarian, was a librarian for 22 years at the East Baton Rouge Parish Library System before she became branch director, and she has the quality that the best librarians have, which is a profound and egalitarian curiosity about all human endeavor. She believes that every subject is interesting if you approach it correctly, that the failure to be interested in something is a failure of approach rather than a failure of the subject, and she has operated by this belief in every domain of her life, which means she raised a child who was relentlessly, sometimes exhaustingly, interested in everything. I was the only child. This matters. I was the entire focus of two very intelligent, very different people's ambitions for their progeny, and the intersection of my father's precision and my mother's curiosity, and the specific pressure of being an only child whose parents are watching very carefully, is the petri dish in which I grew. I was academically exceptional. I don't say this with arrogance. I say it with the factual flatness of someone reporting a data point that was, in context, both a gift and a source of significant complication. I graduated from high school at 16, skipped 2 grades, a decision my parents made and my teachers supported, and I, too young to understand the social consequences, agreed to. I finished my undergraduate degree in business administration at LSU at 19. I was the youngest person in my cohort at every stage of my education, which meant I was perpetually surrounded by people who were older than me by enough of a margin to make me feel permanently slightly outside the natural social current, like a person walking on a moving walkway going the wrong direction. This is not a complaint. The early graduation, the acceleration, gave me things I have used. It also cost me things I am still, at 31, intermittently paying for. After my undergraduate degree, I worked for 3 years at a management consulting firm in New Orleans called Bressard and Associates, where I was the youngest analyst by 4 years and the only black woman in the professional staff, which is not unusual enough in Louisiana corporate environments to require extensive comment, but which shaped the specific set of adaptive skills I developed during that period. I learned to be in rooms where I was underestimated and to use the underestimation productively, to let the lowered expectation create a gap, and then fill that gap with something better than what was expected. I learned to read clients, what they said they wanted versus what they actually needed, the disconnect between the presenting problem and the structural problem underneath it. I learned that the most valuable thing you can give a client is not a solution, but a better understanding of their own question. I also developed during those 3 years the idea that would become my company. The idea started with a problem I noticed while working on a project for a regional food distribution company in Mississippi. They were struggling with a disconnect between their supplier relationships, mostly small to mid-sized farms and food producers in the Gulf South, and their retail buyers. Not a logistics problem and not a pricing problem, but a communication and documentation problem. The suppliers could not provide the traceability and certification documentation that the larger retail buyers were increasingly requiring, not because the quality or the practices weren't there, but because the administrative capacity to document and certify them wasn't there. Small producers, often family operations, with excellent products and sustainable practices, being shut out of markets they could legitimately serve because of a documentation gap that had nothing to do with the actual quality of what they were selling. I wrote a 30-page internal memo about this at Bressard. My supervising partner read it, said it was excellent work, and filed it in the project documentation where it stayed. I thought about it for 14 months. In my 23rd year, I quit Bressard. I moved back to Baton Rouge into my parents' house, into my childhood bedroom with the window that faced the magnolia tree in the backyard, and I started building the thing I had been thinking about for 14 months. The company was called Provenance. The concept was a certification and documentation platform for small and mid-sized agricultural producers, initially in the Gulf South, eventually beyond, that translated their actual practices, their actual standards, their actual quality into the credentialed, auditable, retail buyer-readable documentation that the market required. Not manufacturing documentation that didn't exist, documenting what was actually there. Creating the infrastructure of proof for quality that was real but invisible. I believed in this with a conviction that I have only felt about a handful of things in my life, the kind of conviction that doesn't require the usual deliberation because it presents itself as already decided. I had looked at a problem that was causing real damage to real people, and I had seen a solution that was specific, buildable, and needed, and I had understood that building it was what I was supposed to do next. My parents did not share this conviction. I want to be fair to them. I want to be genuinely fair, which means I have to resist the pull toward the easy version of this story where they are simply wrong, and I am simply right, and the narrative arc is clean. The truth is more complicated, and the complication is part of what makes it worth telling. My father sat across from me at the dining room table, the same table where he had helped me with calculus homework, where we had eaten Sunday dinners for 19 years, where arguments in our household were conducted with the formal structure of legal proceedings, because that was the only kind my father knew, and he listened to my pitch for provenance with his full attention, which is not a small thing. His full attention is a serious instrument. Then he said, "You're 23 years old, you have no startup experience, you have no agricultural industry experience, you have no existing relationships with the producer base you're describing or with the retail buyers, you have no proprietary technology, you have savings from 3 years of analyst work. What is the first mover advantage that prevents a larger company from doing exactly this, better resourced, once you've proved the concept?" These were excellent questions. They were the right questions. I had partial answers and I gave them, and he found the partial answers insufficient, and I found his insufficiency of the partial answers overly focused on risk at the expense of opportunity, and the conversation circled for 2 hours and ended without resolution. My mother was more intuitive in her objection. She said, "Solil, you are 23, you have your whole life. There's no urgency that requires you to do this now instead of in 5 years when you have more." I said, "The problem is now. The producers losing market access are losing it now." She said, "They've been losing it for years, 5 more years won't." I said, "It will. The certification requirements are accelerating. The window where you can build this and capture the early relationships is closing." She looked at me with the expression she has always had, when I am saying something she knows is probably true and wishes wasn't, the expression that is a combination of pride in my reasoning and resistance to what the reasoning implies. She said, "I just think you should wait." I said, "I'm not going to wait." This is where, in retrospect, I can see the first divergence in the story we were each telling. I heard asterisk, "I think you should wait as I don't believe in your idea." She meant, "I understand now, I am afraid for you and the waiting is the fear speaking." Those are different things, and I could not distinguish between them at 23, and the failure to distinguish cost us something. I was in my childhood bedroom for 2 months. During those 2 months I built the first version of what would become Provenance's platform, using my savings, a laptop, and the knowledge I had assembled at Bressed. I started making calls to producers I had identified through my research. I contacted a woman named Theodora Blanchard, who ran a small organic vegetable farm 40 miles outside Baton Rouge, and who had lost a significant retail contract the previous year because she couldn't provide the documentation a new buyer required, and I asked if I could visit. Theodora Blanchard was the first producer who trusted me. She is important to this story, and I am going to give her the space she deserves later. For now, she said yes. My father found out I was making business calls from my childhood bedroom the way parents find things out, through the specific ambient awareness that comes from proximity, from hearing enough fragments to assemble the picture. He asked me directly. I told him directly. He said, "You're doing this here in our house." I said, "For now, while I build the initial client base." He said, "And then?" I said, "And then I'll move. Atlanta, probably. There's a startup ecosystem there, agricultural tech is growing, the market is right." He looked at me with an expression I had seen on his face in legal arguments, the expression of someone who has identified the fatal flaw in the opposing argument and is deciding how directly to name it. He said, "You've already decided." I said, "Yes." He said, "You've been decided since before you came home." I said, "Yes." He said, "Then why are you here?" I said, "Because I needed somewhere to work from for the first stage, and because," I stopped. He said, "Because." I said, "Because I still wanted to try to get you to understand." He was quiet for a moment, then he said something that I have carried since. "Understanding and agreeing are not the same thing. I understand everything you've said. I think you're making a significant mistake. Both of those things are true." I said, "I know." I moved to Atlanta 8 weeks later. Before I tell you about Atlanta and what I built there, I need to tell you what happened in Baton Rouge after I left, because this is the part that the magazine cover intersects with, and you need to understand the full shape of it. My father called me 3 weeks after I moved. This was the third call since I left. We had established a kind of cautious communication pattern, checking in, reporting basic facts, maintaining the connection without quite being able to discuss the central thing that had created distance between us. He asked how things were going. I told him I had 3 signed contracts with Gulf South producers and 1 letter of intent from a potential retail buyer. He said that was good. I said thank you. Then he said, I spoke to Walter Gaines at the firm. Walter Gaines was my father's senior partner, the man who had built Bressard and Associates into what it was. I had met him twice at firm events, a tall, deliberate man who spoke as though each sentence had been reviewed by counsel before release. I said, about what? He said, about provenance, about the concept. I described it to him. My father had described my business concept to his senior partner without telling me he was going to do this. I felt the complicated feeling of this, both touched and invaded, both that he cared enough to seek input and that he had done it without my knowledge or consent. I said, what did he say? My father said, he said it was an interesting idea in a space with real need, but that without proprietary technology, the business model had limited defensibility, and that the certification space had some regulatory considerations that would require specific legal infrastructure. I said, I know about the regulatory considerations. I'm working with an attorney in Atlanta. He said, I know, I told him that. He said, a pause. He said the idea was good and the person behind it would need to be exceptional to make it work at scale without more capital than you likely have. I said, I am exceptional. My father said, I know that, that's not in question. I said, then what is? He said, whether exceptional is sufficient. We were quiet for a moment. I said, Papa, I'm going to build this. I need you to know that I'm going to build this and I stopped, started again. I need you to be on the side of me building it. Even if you can't be on the side of thinking it's a good idea. He said, those may be the same side. I said, they're not. He said, Solil. I said, they're not the same side. Believing in someone and supporting them even when you disagree with their choices are different. I need the second one. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I'll try. It was at that moment the best he could give me. I accepted it. The call ended. I went back to work. What I did not know, what I would not find out for many months, not until Patience told me with the blunt honesty that is her specific gift to the world, was what was happening in Baton Rouge in parallel. The story my parents were telling was not the story I thought they were telling. In the Baton Rouge community where my parents lived, in the specific social geography of Nigerian American professional families, in the church and the neighborhood and the law firm's social world and the library system's social world, the fact of me, an only child who had been academically exceptional, who had been tracked for conventional professional success, who had then left a good job to start a business in Atlanta, required explanation. Communities have a specific gravity around narratives of children. They want to know, how did they turn out? The only child pressure that had shaped my upbringing did not end when I left Magnolia Street. It followed me, in the form of the story being told about me in rooms I wasn't in. My father is a precise man. When precise men tell a story they are not sure of, they often tell it in the most controlled version, the version where uncertainty becomes a kind of acknowledged anticipation of failure. I think my father, asked by colleagues and church members and neighbors about what Solil was doing in Atlanta, said something like, she's trying a business, we'll see how it goes. I think he said it in the tone of a man who is not confident it will go, and that tone, transmitted through the social network of a tight community, became over time a tone of already acknowledged failure. By the time I had been in Atlanta for 6 months, the story in Baton Rouge had apparently become, Solil tried a business and it didn't work out. She's in Atlanta, things are difficult. By the time I had been there a year, the story had evolved. Patience told me this in fragments, over a series of texts, each one preceded by the phrase I probably shouldn't say this, but which is Patience's signal that she is about to say the most important thing. I probably shouldn't say this, but people keep asking me what happened with your business, and I keep saying it's going fine, and then they look at me like I'm being polite. I probably shouldn't say this, but Aunt Kai told Mrs. Effon at church that you were regrouping after a difficult setback, and Mrs. Effon told my mom who told me. I probably shouldn't say this, but your dad told someone at the firm that you had moved to Atlanta after the business didn't work, and were trying to figure out next steps. I probably shouldn't say this, but they're not exactly lying, they're just telling the version where you failed, and everyone believes it because no one's hearing a different version. I read these texts late at night, in my apartment in Atlanta, which at that point was a one-bedroom in Inman Park that I had furnished with the minimum necessary, and that contained, along one wall of the main room, the infrastructure of provenance: 2 monitors, a filing system, a whiteboard covered in relationship maps and process diagrams, and the names of every producer and every potential retail buyer and every regulatory requirement I was tracking. The apartment smelled like coffee, and the specific focused smell of a person who is working at the edge of their capacity. I sat with Patience's texts, and I felt something that I did not fully allow myself to feel then, something that was a combination of grief and fury, and the specific loneliness of being misrepresented by the people who know you best, which is a different loneliness from being misunderstood by strangers, is a loneliness with teeth. I called Patience. She answered immediately, which meant she had been waiting. I said, "How long has this been going on?" She said, "I think since pretty early, like a few months after you left." I said, "They've been telling people I failed for almost a year." She said, "I don't think they think of it as telling people you failed. I think they think of it as managing expectations, theirs and everyone else's." I said, "Managing expectations toward what?" She said, "Toward you coming home, toward it not working out and you coming home and it being okay. I think, Solil, I think they've been building a story that makes the ending where you come home not be shameful, because they think you're going to come home." I was quiet for a long time. I said, "I'm not coming home." She said, "I know." I said, "The business is Patience, it's working. I have 18 clients. I have a term sheet from a small VC. I just hired my first employee." She was quiet. I said, "Does that surprise you?" She said, "No, it confirms what I told everyone who would listen. But yes, I mean, I knew you, I believed you, but you've been so quiet about it. Why haven't you?" I said, "Because I didn't want it to be about proving them wrong. I wanted to build it first and let it be real first, and then." I stopped, realized something. I said, "I was waiting until I was sure enough to come back with it, and I wasn't sure enough yet. But while I was waiting..." She said, "The story was becoming permanent." I said, "Yes." We were quiet together for a moment on the phone. Then Patience said, "Solil, you need to let people know what's actually happening, not for them, for you, because the story that's out there is about you and you're not in it. I need to tell you about the people who were there during the building, because a story about what gets built is incomplete without the people who held tools alongside you." The first employee I mentioned to Patience was a woman named Odette Marchand. 29 at the time I hired her, from Lafayette, Louisiana, with a degree in agricultural science from LSU and 2 years of experience at an organic certification body in California that had, in her words, the right mission and the wrong execution, and which she had left because she could see how it should be done better and had not been given the latitude to do it. She found provenance through an online job board, applied with a cover letter that was 3 paragraphs long and contained no filler. Every sentence earned, every sentence a data point, and within 20 minutes of our first interview, I knew I was going to hire her and that the business would change shape because of her presence in it. Odette is from a Cajun farming family. Her grandfather grew rice in the Atchafalaya Basin. Her mother runs a crawfish operation. She grew up understanding agricultural production not as a subject but as a lived reality, and this understanding, the knowledge of what it actually costs a producer to maintain quality, to track practices, to face down a season that goes wrong, is the knowledge that made provenance work in a way that a purely technical or business-trained founder could not have achieved alone. She also has the specific Cajun directness that I have always found bracing in the best possible way, a quality of saying exactly what she means with no social cushioning, not because she lacks warmth, but because she considers cushioning to be a form of disrespect, a withholding of the real thing. On her first day, she looked at the whiteboard in my apartment/office and said, Your documentation process has a gap in the traceability chain between soil amendment records and harvest records. It'll fail an audit at Tier 2 certification. I said, I know, I haven't solved it yet. She said, I have, do you want to hear it? I said, yes. She sat down and told me, she was right, we implemented it that week. That is Odette. The second person I need to tell you about is a man named Kweku Asante. He is from Accra originally, came to Atlanta for graduate school in computer science, stayed, built a career in software development, and was, when I met him, doing consulting work for several small tech companies while looking for something with a mission he could believe in. We met at a small business networking event in Buckhead that I attended mostly because Provenance's first investor, a woman named Vivienne Carwell, whom I will describe properly in a moment, told me I needed to be visible in Atlanta's startup community and stop hiding in my apartment. Kweku was the only other person at this networking event who was not making small talk. He was standing near the wall reading something on his phone. And I walked over because I recognized the specific posture of someone who is at an event, because they think they should be but would rather be working. I said, what are you reading? He said, an agricultural technology report from the USDA, traceability systems section. I said, I built a traceability system. He looked up, he said, for what scale of operation? And we talked for 40 minutes in the corner of a networking event, ignoring the event entirely. And by the end I had explained provenance, and he had identified 3 technical architecture decisions I had made that were reasonable at my current scale, and would become significant bottlenecks at 5 times the scale, and had sketched on the back of a networking event program the outline of how to solve them. He became Provenance's CTO 8 months later. He took below market rate in exchange for equity, and has not once in the time I have known him expressed anything other than a calm certainty that the decision was right. Kweku is the kind of person who makes decisions once, on good information, and then executes them without the second guessing that consumes so much human energy. He is my operational counterpart in a way that I think of as structural, not just a colleague but a load-bearing wall of the company. Vivienne Carwell is the third person I need to tell you about, and she is the most unexpected. I found Vivienne through a cold email. I had been sending cold emails to angel investors in the agricultural technology space for 6 weeks, using research I had compiled from startup databases and LinkedIn, crafting individual emails that were specific to each person's investment history and stated interests. Most of them did not reply. Some replied with polite declines. One sent a template rejection that was so obviously templated that I found it mildly insulting and mildly hilarious in equal measure. Vivienne replied to mine within 4 hours with 3 words, tell me more. I told her more. She asked for a deck. I sent the deck. She asked for a call. We had the call. It lasted 90 minutes and covered territory I had not expected. She asked about my parents, about my background, about what I understood about the specific psychology of small agricultural producers, about my theory of the regulatory trajectory in the food traceability space over the next decade. She asked about failure, not whether I had failed, but what I thought failure felt like from the inside, and whether I had experienced it, and what I had done with the experience. I told her about a project at Bressed that I had been primary analyst on, a restructuring recommendation for a regional retailer that had been implemented and had produced results that were the opposite of what I had projected, not catastrophically, but measurably. And I told her what I had done with that. Gone back to the model, found the assumption I had made that was wrong, understood why I had made it, built a checklist for future models that required me to explicitly examine that category of assumption. She said, most people I talk to describe their failures as bad luck or external factors. You described a systematic error and a systematic correction. I said, bad luck exists, but most of what looks like bad luck is a failure to account for something you should have accounted for. She said, how old are you? I said, 24. She said, that answer sounded like someone twice your age. I said, I grew up in a house with a corporate attorney. Systematic thinking is a second language. She laughed, real laughter, not polite. She said, I'm going to write you a check. I'm going to tell you what I expect in terms of reporting and communication. And I'm going to introduce you to 3 people who will either become your investors or your advisors or both, and how that goes is up to you. I said, thank you. She said, don't thank me. Thanking investors before they've done anything is the startup equivalent of celebrating a touchdown before the goal line. Do the work. I did the work. Theodora Blanchard. I promised to come back to her, and I am keeping that promise now because Theodora is not a supporting character in this story. She is one of its central pillars, and I did not understand that until about 18 months in, when I began to understand that what Provenance was actually doing. The thing underneath the business model, the thing that the platform and the certifications and the documentation were in service of, was something that Theodora had been articulating to me from the very beginning, and that I had heard but not fully listened to. Theodora Blanchard is 63 years old. She runs a certified organic vegetable farm called Blue Heron Farm in St. Helena Parish, Louisiana, that her family has worked for 4 generations. She is the first person in her family to obtain organic certification, which she did 12 years before I met her, through a process she described to me as 3 years of paperwork and 2 years of waiting and 1 year of someone at the certifying body actually reading what I sent. She is a black woman farming land in Louisiana in the 21st century, which contains within it a history so dense and so specific that the 8 words I just used to describe it are essentially a code that requires volumes to decode. And I am not going to pretend that I can decode it properly here, except to say that I knew, when I sat across from her at her kitchen table on the first visit, that what she had built was something that had required a form of will that I could not fully measure. She gave me 3 hours on that first visit. She showed me her fields and her record-keeping system, meticulous, handwritten in journals that went back 15 years, the kind of documentation that told a complete story of a farm's practices, and would have been worth its weight in gold if anyone with the right buyer credentials had known how to read it and certify it. She showed me the contract she had lost, the retail buyer's requirements that her documentation, despite being comprehensive and honest, had not met because it wasn't in the right format, hadn't been produced by the right kind of audit process. She said, I have been farming this land for 40 years. My mother farmed it. Her father farmed it. I know exactly what goes into this ground and what comes out of it, and I can tell you on any given Tuesday what every plant in those fields is experiencing. And I lost a contract that would have paid my operating costs for a year because I couldn't produce a PDF in the right format. I said, that's what I'm trying to fix. She looked at me. She has a way of looking at people that is very thorough, not unfriendly, but complete, like she is reading something that takes a moment to fully read. She said, how old are you? I said, 23. She said, who sent you? I said, no one. I found you through a producer database, and through a news article about the contract you lost. It was in a trade publication. She said, they wrote about it. I said, a short piece, about small producers losing retail access due to certification gaps. She said, I didn't know that. I said, I have a copy. She read the copy. She put it down on the table and looked out the window at her fields. She said, what do you need from me? I said, I need to understand your documentation system well enough to build a platform that can translate it into retail buyer-readable format. I need to understand what the gaps are, not what you're doing wrong, because I don't think you're doing anything wrong, but where the translation fails. She said, that's going to take more than 1 visit. I said, I know. She said, and what do I get? I said, a prototype of the platform, certification support, access to buyers I'm building relationships with, and if it works, a better contract than the one you lost. She said, and if it doesn't work? I said, you'll have lost some time talking to me, which I'll try to make worth your while, and you'll have documentation of your practices in a more organized format than you currently have, which is useful regardless. She looked at me again with that thorough look. She said, you're not doing the thing young people usually do. I said, what thing? She said, promising things you don't know if you can deliver. You're telling me what you know and what you don't know and letting me decide. I said, it's the only honest way. She said, sit down, I'll make coffee. I sat down, she made coffee. We talked for another 2 hours, and by the time I drove back to Baton Rouge that evening, I had the beginning of everything. Year 1 in Atlanta. I've told you about Odette and Kweku and Vivienne. I've told you about Theodora. I haven't told you about the daily texture of that year, which was the hardest thing I've ever done, while simultaneously being the thing I was most clearly meant to be doing. A combination that creates a specific kind of exhaustion and a specific kind of aliveness that I have never experienced in any other context. The apartment, the whiteboard, the coffee that was always either too hot or cold because I forgot about it, the calls with producers at odd hours because farmers keep farm hours, and if you want to talk to them, you talk to them at 5:30 in the morning or 8 in the evening, not at 2 in the afternoon. The calls with potential retail buyers who were interested in the concept but cautious, who needed to see more clients, more audit trails, more proof. The regulatory research. I became, out of necessity, more knowledgeable about food traceability regulation than I had ever expected to be, building a map of current requirements and projected future requirements in every state that mattered to my producers, which meant reading regulatory documents at midnight with the specific attention of someone for whom this is not abstract but existential. I ran out of money in month 7. Not completely, I had Vivienne's investment and I was generating some revenue. But the operating costs of building the platform, paying Odette her salary, covering my own rent and basic expenses, and funding the producer onboarding process, which involved visits, which involved travel, exceeded what was coming in by enough to require an answer. I sold my car. I used the money to make payroll and cover the platform development costs for 2 months. I took the MARTA everywhere I needed to go in Atlanta and rented cars for producer visits. This is a practical detail that I include because it represents the actual texture of building something real. Not the dramatic moments, but the continuous stream of small decisions that constitute the actual work, each one a load-bearing choice, each one requiring you to be clear-eyed about what the priority is. The priority was provenance, everything else was negotiable. In month 9 I closed a small Series A round, Vivienne leading, 2 other investors who she had introduced me to and who had been watching the first-year progress. $600,000, enough to hire Kweku, enough to formalize the platform, enough to expand the producer base from 18 to 40 within the next year. The week the round closed, I called my parents. My mother answered. I told her, I said, we just closed a funding round, 600,000. Kweku is joining as CTO, we have 40 producers in the pipeline. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, that's wonderful, Solil. She said it with warmth, real warmth, but underneath the warmth I heard it, because I know her voice the way you know the instrument you've been listening to your whole life. There was something that was recalibrating, a story she had been holding that was encountering information that didn't fit it. I said, Mama, can you put Papa on? She put him on. I told him the same things. He was quiet for longer than she had been. He said, 600,000. I said, yes. He said, leading investor is. I said, Vivienne Carwell. She runs Carwell Impact Investments. She focuses on agricultural technology and food system businesses. He said, I'll look her up. I said, please do. Another pause. He said, Solil, I want to. I said, not yet, let me build it first. Let me make it real enough that the conversation about it is about something real. Okay. He said, okay. I don't know even now whether that was the right thing to say. Maybe I should have had the conversation then. Maybe I should have pushed for the acknowledgement I needed in that moment. But I was 24, and I was in the middle of building something and I needed all of my energy to go into the building. And the emotional work of the conversation with my parents was something I could not afford to do incompletely, so I deferred it until I could do it fully. In the meantime, in Baton Rouge, the story continued to be told. Let me tell you about the magazine, how it happened, because the cover was not an accident and it was not luck, and it was not the result of a publicist or a PR campaign or any of the things that publications sometimes write as though they are organic discoveries. Meridian Business is a regional business magazine covering the Southeast United States, headquartered in Atlanta, with a readership of approximately 80,000 and a reputation in its space for substantive profiles of businesses doing genuinely interesting work, rather than the advertorial puffery that fills many of its category. It has a cover story each issue that the editorial team takes seriously, not a puff piece, not a brand promotional piece, but a reported story with access and depth. In year 3 of provenance, by which point we had 92 producer clients in 5 states, a team of 11 people, a platform that had gone through 2 major iterations and was processing certification documentation for over 400 individual product lines, and 2 significant retail distribution partnerships that had resulted in a combined 39% revenue increase for our producers versus their pre-provenance market access. I was contacted by a reporter named Simon Adayinka. Simon is 38, has been at *Meridian Business for 9 years, and has a reputation among Atlanta business people that I had already encountered, not because she is aggressive or adversarial, but because she is thorough in a way that makes people uncomfortable if they have things they would prefer not to be made transparent. She had heard about provenance through a source at one of our retail partners and had been tracking the company for 6 months before she reached out to me. When she did reach out, she had already talked to 5 of our producers, 2 of our retail partners and Vivienne Carwell. She had also, I would learn later, called my father. She told me this in our 3rd interview session, which took place in the provenance office. We had, by year 3, a proper office in Midtown Atlanta, 1,000 square feet with a small conference room and 9 desks, and a wall of windows that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that I found consistently useful. And she mentioned it the way she mentioned everything, directly and without cushioning. As a fact she was sharing because transparency about her reporting process was something she considered important. She said, "I called your father, Obira Ape, in Baton Rouge. I found him through the Louisiana State Bar." I said, "What did he say?" She said, she looked at her notebook. He said, "My daughter is doing important work and I'm proud of her." Those were his words. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "When did you call him?" She said, 3 weeks ago. I said, "He hadn't said that to me directly." She said, "I know, he told me that too. He said he hadn't been." She looked at her notebook again. "He said he hadn't been as present as he should have been in supporting her and that he was working on that. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was reporting a fact about a case." I felt something shift in my chest. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of something. I said, "What else?" She said, "He told me about the dinner table conversation when you first pitched the business. He described your argument, the market gap, the documentation problem, the producer access issue. He described it accurately and in detail." She paused. "He remembered your exact argument. He had it." I said, "He was a corporate attorney for 30 years. He never forgets an argument." She said, "No, but he said, I'm writing this down because I want to be accurate," he said. She was right. She saw something I didn't see or didn't want to see, and she was right. The office was quiet around me. Through the wall of windows, Atlanta was doing its morning thing, light moving across buildings, the city assembling itself from its nighttime version into its daytime one. I said, "He said that to you, a reporter?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Before he said it to me?" She said, "Yes." She was watching me carefully. She is good at this, at watching without intruding, at giving a person room to land somewhere before she asks the next question. I said, "I think I need some water." She said, "Of course." I got water, I came back, we continued. The cover shoot happened on a Wednesday in January. The photographer's name was Bastian Okafor, mid-30s, Lagos-born, Atlanta-based, with a portfolio that I had looked at the night before and that had made me understand why they had chosen him. He shot people in a way that was not flattering in the airbrushed sense, but honest in a way that is rarer and better. He found the quality of a person that was most essentially theirs, and found the light and the angle that made it visible. We shot in the office and then outside, in the parking area behind the building where there was a wall of old brick that caught the afternoon light differently from the morning light inside. Bastian said, "Tell me something about the business that you haven't said in any interview." I said, "That's an unusual thing to ask during a photo shoot." He said, "I know, answer it anyway." I thought for a moment. I said, "The thing I didn't expect, the thing I couldn't have known going in is that the documentation work is actually an act of restoration. When we help a producer build their record-keeping system, we're helping them construct a formal record of something that was already there, their knowledge, their practices, their relationship with their land. And a lot of these producers, especially the ones with deep history on the land, have never had their knowledge formally recognized. It's always been informal." always been the thing they know that no one with institutional authority has certified. And when we certify it not just for market access but as a record that says, this knowledge is real and documented and valid, something happens that I didn't fully anticipate. People cry sometimes, not because they got a contract, because someone finally said, what you know matters. He took the photograph at the end of that sentence. I know because I heard the shutter. It's the cover photograph. I'm looking slightly off camera, at something slightly above and to the left of the lens, and the light is the late afternoon gold of January in Atlanta, and there is an expression on my face that I could not have produced deliberately, could not have manufactured or posed, the expression of someone who has just said something true and is feeling the truth of it settle in them. The cover line reads, she saw what the market was missing and built what it needed. Below my name, Solil Ape, founder and CEO, provenance. 8 ounces, half a pound. The magazine was published on a Monday in March. Simone sent me a copy in advance, a courtesy for interview subjects, and I received it on the Friday before publication. I sat in my apartment, the new apartment, a 2-bedroom in Old Fourth Ward that I had moved into when Provenance's revenue finally made it possible, the apartment with the morning light that I loved and the desk by the window, where I wrote the things I needed to write to understand them. And I held the magazine and looked at my face on the cover, and felt something that I have struggled to name precisely. Not pride, pride is too small, not vindication, that's too backward-looking, too focused on the people who doubted, something more forward-facing than both of those, something like this is real and documented and on paper and can be held in 2 hands and weighed. I texted Odette, it's here. She texted back a string of exclamation points that was so out of character for her that I laughed out loud. I texted Kweku, it's here. He texted, send me a photo. I sent a photo, he replied, the light is excellent, Bastian did good work. I texted Vivienne, it's here. She replied, I know, I've had an advance copy for a week, I wanted you to have it before I told anyone. I texted Theodora, the magazine is out Monday, I want you to know the story mentions you by name with your permission as we discussed, you're in it the way you should be in it. She replied after a few minutes, baby, I've been waiting for that magazine since the day you first sat at my kitchen table. I told my whole church. I sat at my desk and I thought about calling my parents. I had not told them the magazine was coming. I had not told them about the cover story at all, not because I was hiding it, but because I was still, in some complicated way, protecting the moment, waiting until it was real enough to bring to them whole. I did not call them Friday. I told myself I would call Saturday. Then I told myself Sunday. Then the magazine was out on Monday and I was in back-to-back meetings from 8 in the morning, and by the time I thought about calling it was Tuesday evening and my phone lit up with a call from Patience. She said, I need to tell you something. I said, the magazine. She said, the magazine arrived at your parents' house today. The subscription mailing, it's on their list. Your dad still subscribes to about 9 business publications. I said, I know. She said, did you know it was going to their house? I said, no, I didn't think about the mailing list, I stopped. I wasn't thinking about that specifically. She said, Solil, your mom sat on the kitchen floor. And then she sent me the photograph. I looked at the photograph of my mother sitting on the kitchen floor of the house on Magnolia Street, holding the magazine with my face on it, for a long time. My mother is 61 years old. She has been a librarian for most of her adult life, which means she has spent 30 years helping people find things, the right book, the right information, the right words for whatever it is they're trying to understand. She knows more about the organization of knowledge than almost anyone I have ever met. She knows how to find things in the dark by feel, by the systematic application of an indexing principle. She knows how to hold information carefully and give it to people in the form they need it. She was sitting on her kitchen floor holding a magazine, and I understood, looking at the photograph, that what she was holding was not just a magazine. She was holding the documentation of something she had known was possible for her daughter, and had not been able to fully believe in for the years it took to become real, and the distance between what she had known and what she had let herself believe had just collapsed, and the kitchen floor was where she had landed. My father was next to her, his hand was on her back. I said to Patience, did she see you take the photo? She said, no, I was in the backyard. I'd come over for dinner and I went outside to check something on my phone and I looked through the window and, a pause. I didn't mean to take it as a voyeuristic thing. I just wanted you to know. I took it and sent it to you and then I went inside. I said, what did you say when you went inside? She said, I just texted Solil. And your mom looked up and she said, good. I said, good. She said, just that, good. I put my phone down. I went to my kitchen and I stood at the counter, and I did the thing I almost never do, which is let myself feel the full dimension of something without immediately converting it into analysis or action or forward motion. I let myself feel it. The floor and the magazine and my mother's face and my father's hand on her back, and the years of the wrong story being told, and the years of building in the apartment with the whiteboard and the forgotten coffee, and Theodora at her kitchen table, and Odette's cover letter with no filler, and Kweku's sketch on the back of a networking event program, and Vivienne's 3 words, tell me more. I let all of it be there at once. Then I picked up my phone and I called home. My father answered. He said, Solil. I said, Papa. We were quiet for a moment. He said, we received the magazine. I said, I know, Patience told me. He said, your mother is, he stopped. She's fine, she's in the other room. I said, are you okay? He said, I've been reading the article, I read it twice. I said, all 32 pages. He said, every word twice. I said, Papa. He said, the reporter Simona Dianka, she quoted Theodora Blanchard, she quoted several of your producers, she described the platform in technical terms that were accurate. A pause. I looked up the technical terms I didn't know, I looked them up before I read it the second time. This is my father, he looked up the terms he didn't know, he prepared before the second reading. I said, what did you think? He said, I think, a long pause. The kind of pause that in my father means something is being constructed with precision, that the words are being selected from a field of options and arranged according to standards. I think I owe you an apology. More than one, I think I have told a story about you that was not the right story, to people who should have been told the right story. I said, yes. He said, I told it because I was afraid. I think I was afraid that if I let myself believe fully in what you were building, and it failed, I would not have. He stopped again. I would not have managed that well. So I managed the expectation down, and I managed it down in front of other people, which was. I said, which was a betrayal. The word sat between us on the phone line. He said, yes. I said, I know you didn't intend it as one. He said, intent and impact are different, you taught me that. In your argument at the dining room table you used those words. You said, the intent of the certification system isn't the problem, the impact is. And I've thought about that often. I used it in a brief last year, and I've thought about it in relation to this. I said, you used it in a brief. He said, yes. I said, Papa. He said, I know. I said, I needed you to believe in me, not to think I was right, not to agree with my business plan, to believe in me. Those are different things and you knew they were different things. He said, yes. I said, why couldn't you? A long silence, longer than the others. He said, because believing in you completely without conditions, without the managed expectation, without the safety net of the lower story, required me to accept that if you failed it would hurt in a way I had no language for, and I have spent 30 years building a professional life on the management of risk. He stopped, started again. I tried to manage the risk of loving you. The line was quiet. I said, you can't manage that risk. He said, I know that now. I said, you could have known it before. He said, yes. I said, but you didn't. He said, no. I said, okay. He said, okay. I said, I mean, I need time with this. I need to be able to say what I just said to you and have it sit for a while. I need you to sit with it too. But I stopped. I also need you to know that I've been waiting for this conversation for 3 years. I needed it then and I couldn't have it because I was too inside the building and I needed all of myself for that. But I've needed it. He said, I know, I'm sorry I made you wait. I'm sorry I made the waiting worse. I said, is Mama there? He said, yes. I said, can I talk to her? I heard him move, footsteps, a door. his voice saying something quiet that I couldn't make out, and then my mother's voice, which is a different instrument from my father's, warmer and more variable, the voice of someone who was born expressive and never had to learn it. She said, "Solil." I said, "Mama." She said, "Baby." And that one word, that single word, baby asterisk, the word she has used for me since before I could understand language, the first word I remember hearing in a tone that told me I was known and wanted, that word undid something that I had been holding very tightly for a very long time, and I sat in my apartment in Atlanta, and I cried in the way that you cry when the thing you've been waiting for finally arrives, and its arrival is both relief and grief simultaneously. Because it shows you the full size of what the waiting cost. My mother said, "I'm so proud of you, I have always been proud of you. Even when I couldn't find the words for what you were building, I was proud, and I was wrong to let fear speak louder than pride. I was wrong." I said, "I know." She said, "The photographer found you." I said, "What?" She said, "On the cover, the way you look. He found the real you, the you I know." I said, "What does the real me look like?" She said, "Like someone who has already decided, like someone who is looking at something no one else can see yet and knows it will be real." I need to tell you what happened next in Baton Rouge, because this story is not over at the phone call. The phone call was necessary and true, and I am glad I have given you its full shape, but the world keeps moving after the hard conversations, and what the world does next is sometimes the most important part. My mother, in the days following the magazine's arrival at their house, did something that I did not anticipate, and that I have come to think of as one of the most extraordinary things she has done in the relationship between her and me, which is a relationship that contains many extraordinary things. She is the branch director of the East Baton Rouge Parish Library. She has, in that role, a platform that she uses with the specific purposefulness of a person who has spent a career understanding that information is not neutral, that what gets known and how it gets known shapes what is possible. She organized, within 3 weeks of the magazine's arrival, a community business event at the library, a panel discussion on entrepreneurship in the Gulf South, with a specific focus on agricultural and food system innovation. She invited Theodora Blanchard to speak. She contacted me. She asked if I would join by video if I couldn't make it in person. I went in person. I drove from Atlanta to Baton Rouge on a Friday evening. I pulled into the driveway on Magnolia Street at 11 at night, and my mother was awake, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, and when I got out of the car she stood up and opened her arms, and I walked into them, and she held me the way she held me when I was a child and the world had been difficult, with the specific quality of a hold that says, "You are safe here. This is home. Whatever was hard is allowed to be hard." My father came out a few minutes later in his bathrobe, because it was 11 at night. He stood on the porch and he looked at me for a moment, and then he did something I cannot remember him doing since I was very small. He put both hands on my face, my father's precise, careful hands on my face, and he looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded, the nod of a man who is saying something that he cannot say in words and is saying it anyway. I nodded back. We went inside. My mother made tea. My father and I sat at the dining room table, and he asked about provenance, not the way he had asked in the past, with the structural rigor of someone looking for weakness, but the way a person asks about something they want to understand because they want to understand it, because it matters to them, because the person who built it is sitting across from them and they are finally, fully ready to see what that person has built. I talked until 2 in the morning. He listened with his full attention. My mother sat with us, contributing and occasionally correcting my memory on small factual details because she had, I discovered that night, been reading everything she could find about provenance and agricultural technology for the past several months. She had built what I can only describe as a personal research file on my company, a librarian's thorough compilation of every piece of public information, every mention in trade publications, every regulatory development that touched on what we did. She had been following it all along, quietly, from the library, and from the kitchen table, and from wherever she was when she picked up her phone and searched for the latest news on food traceability certification or Gulf South agricultural market access. She had been following it and she had not told me. When I discovered this, when she went to get the folder and showed me, a proper manila folder with printed articles and handwritten notes in the margins in her small, precise librarian's handwriting, I looked at her and I said, "How long?" She said, "Since the first month. I found a trade publication mention of a company called Provenance in an agricultural certification roundup. I started following it then. I said, that was before the Series A. She said, yes. I said, you never said. She said I didn't know how to, and I was. She looked at my father. We had gotten ourselves into a position, we had told a story, and I didn't know how to walk it back without. I said, without admitting the story was wrong. She said, yes. I said, you've been carrying a folder of evidence that your daughter was building something real while telling people she had failed. She said, yes. I said, Mama. She said, I know. We were quiet for a moment. Then I said, can I keep the folder? She looked at me, she said, of course. I said, I want to put it in the office, the folder of articles with your handwriting in the margins, I want it there. She said, why? I said, because it means something that you were following it, even when you couldn't say so, even when the story you were telling publicly was the wrong one, privately you were watching, you were there. She put her hand over her mouth for a moment, then she took it away, then she said, yes, I was there. I said, that matters to me, more than I can properly say. The folder is in my office now. It is behind my desk on the credenza, next to the framed photograph from the cover shoot, and a small painting Theodora gave me, a watercolor of Blue Heron Farm in late afternoon light. Done by her granddaughter, and a post-it note that Odette left on my monitor on our first day in the Midtown office that said, in her no-cushioning way, we have work to do. All 4 of these things are the things I look at when I need to remember where I came from and what it cost, and what it was worth. The library event. 53 people attended, for a Friday evening panel at a public library in Baton Rouge on the subject of entrepreneurship in the agricultural sector. 53 people is genuinely good. My mother had promoted it through every channel available to her, which included the library newsletter, and the church bulletin, and the Nigerian American Professional Association that she and my father had been members of for 20 years, and the specific social network of a woman who has spent her career in community service and knows how to reach people. Many of those 53 people were the people who had been told the wrong story. I did not plan for this. I had thought of the event as something for the general community, for people who might be interested in agricultural entrepreneurship, for people considering starting a business. I had not thought specifically about who would be in that room. I should have. My mother, who had organized it, had. Mrs. Effon from church was there, sitting in the 3rd row in a patterned dress, who had received the story from my mother and passed it on to Patience's mother. Mr. and Mrs. Adeora Banks, who had known my parents since I was a child and who my father golfed with occasionally, who sat in the 4th row, and who I could see whispering to each other when I walked in. Several of my father's colleagues from the firm, including one woman named Janet Hollies who had apparently made the comment, relayed to me through Patience that it was a shame about the ape girl, she had seemed like such a bright one. I sat on the panel with Theodora Blanchard and a small business development officer from the State Agricultural Extension Office. My mother moderated. I am going to tell you something about that room. When I walked in, when I saw who was there, the people who had been told the wrong story, who had nodded sympathetically, who had filed me under asterisk promising child who didn't quite make it asterisk, I felt something that I had to make a decision about. The something was a version of the hunger for vindication that I had told myself I wasn't feeling. The something was the desire to turn to Mrs. Effon in the 3rd row and say, remember the shame, that was incorrect. I made the decision not to do that, not because I was suppressing it charitably, but because I understood, in the moment before I took my seat on the panel, that doing it would make the story about them, and about my parents, and about the wrong story and the correction. And the story I wanted to tell was about Theodora's farm and Odette's cover letter and Kweku's sketch and Vivienne's 3 words. The story I wanted to tell was about the work. So I told that story. I talked about the documentation gap and what it costs producers. I talked about what I had learned from Theodora. I gestured to her. She raised a hand. Several people in the room who knew her or knew of her Blue Heron Farm nodded with a specific recognition. I talked about building Provenance from a spare bedroom, about the funding round, about the team. I talked about what we had produced, the numbers, the outcomes, the percentage increases in producer revenue, the number of contracts that had been restored or newly created because of the certification platform. I talked about what the work meant. And then, this is the part that I had not planned, that arrived from somewhere I did not control, I said. I left Baton Rouge 3 years ago to build this company, and I left without the confidence of a lot of people who loved me. I understand why. I was 23 and I was leaving a job, and I was trying to do something difficult in a space that was hard to explain, and loving someone and being certain that their plan will work are different things, and the people who loved me couldn't be certain. I couldn't be either, honestly. I just thought it was right. And when you think something is right, you do it, and the people who loved you eventually catch up to what you built. I looked at my mother as I said this. She held my gaze. I looked at my father, who was sitting in the second row on the aisle. He was wearing a suit, which he wears to everything, and which at a Friday evening library event made him look both formally overdressed and exactly right. He had his hands folded in his lap. He was looking at me with an expression that I recognized, that I had seen on his face in moments of genuine intellectual encounter, the expression of someone who is receiving something and letting it fully land. I said, my parents are here tonight. They're sitting in this room, and I want to say in front of this room, in front of this community that we are all part of, that the work I've done, everything Provenance is built on a foundation that they gave me. My father taught me to think structurally, to ask the right questions, to understand what argument I was actually making. My mother taught me that everything is interesting if you approach it right, and that you find people by being genuinely curious about them. I used both of those things every single day of the last 3 years. The building was mine to do, but the foundation was theirs. Mrs. Effon in the third row put her hand to her mouth. My father in the second row on the aisle looked at his hands, and then he looked up at me, and he nodded. My mother at the moderator's table wrote something on her notepad. I couldn't see what it was. Later she told me it was. She figured it out. She figured all of it out. Theodora spoke after me. She talked about her farm, about the 4 generations, about the lost contract, and the 3-year fight to recertify through a process that was not designed with her in mind. She talked about what it felt like when Provenance helped her rebuild her documentation, and she walked through a successful audit for the first time. The specific, particular feeling of having something that she had always known to be true recognized formally, and in writing by a system that had not previously had the language for it. She said, I've been farming this land for 40 years, and I've known what was in this land for 40 years, and it took a 23-year-old from Baton Rouge to help me prove it to someone who had the power to act on it. That's not a failure of the 40 years. That's what young people are for, to look at the things the world hasn't built yet and decide to build them. She looked at my mother when she said this. My mother looked back. 2 women, both mothers, one of whom had built a farm and one of whom had built a library, both of whom understood in their specific ways what it means to tend something carefully over time and watch it become something it couldn't have become without the tending. After the event in the library parking lot, I stood with Theodora while people filed past us toward their cars and the warm Louisiana night settled around us. She had driven up from St. Helena Parish for this, 2 hours each way, which she had done without being asked, had offered immediately when my mother called to invite her. I said, you drove 2 hours. She said, I drove 2 hours. I said, you didn't have to. She said, of course I did. You came and sat at my kitchen table when no one had told you anything would come of it. I drove 2 hours to a library. We're even. I said, we're not even, we'll never be even. She said, that's probably true, but we're in it together and that's what counts. She hugged me. Theodora's hugs are a significant physical experience. She is a small woman of compact and absolute density, and when she hugs you, you feel properly held, and then she walked to her truck and drove back to St. Helena Parish. I stood in the parking lot for a moment. My parents came out together. My father was carrying my mother's coat, which he always does, has always done, the specific spousal attentiveness of a man who is not demonstrative in words but who notices and acts. My mother was saying something to Mrs. Effon, who was leaving, and whatever she was saying had the body language of a correction, quiet, firm, final. I found out later what she said. Patience told me because Patience's mother had been standing nearby. My mother said to Mrs. Effon, I want to correct something, the story about Solil that has been in circulation, that she moved away after a difficult setback, that things were hard. That wasn't the right story and it should have been corrected sooner. She has built something extraordinary. The magazine that arrived at our house last week, I'd like you to read it. I'll bring you a copy. Mrs. Efon said something. Patience's mother couldn't hear it, and my mother said, "No, it was our mistake and I'm telling you directly. That's the right thing to do." My mother is 61 years old and she is a librarian, and she understands the organization and correction of information at a level that is structural to who she is. When she identified the wrong information that had been circulated, she corrected it the way she would correct a catalogue error, specifically, directly, with the authority of someone who knows what the right information is. This is the woman who taught me everything about curiosity. This is the woman I called Mama on the phone and cried with from my Atlanta apartment. This is the woman who sat on her kitchen floor with a magazine that weighed 8 ounces and changed everything. I want to tell you about what happened with Provenance in the months that followed the magazine, not because the business outcomes are the point, but because they are part of the full shape of the story, and I do not want to give you an incomplete shape. The magazine produced 2 significant outcomes that I had not anticipated. The first was Winifred Ollowale. She is the managing director of a food retail chain called Harvest Table, 14 locations across the Southeast, positioning as a premium sustainable grocery that had, over the previous 5 years, been deepening its commitment to regional and local sourcing. She read the Meridian business piece on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday her office had called Kweku because they couldn't reach me directly. He called me immediately. She wanted to be a retail partner, not a pilot, a full partnership, with a year-1 commitment to source from a minimum of 15 Provenance-certified producers. This was the kind of contract that changes a company's scale, not incrementally, but categorically. 14 stores, 15 producers minimum, a retail relationship that provided our existing producers with the largest single market opportunity they had ever had. Theodora Blue Heron Farm was one of the 15. I called Theodora the day after the contract was signed. I told her what the contract meant, the volume, the price point, the terms. I told her specifically what her allocation looked like. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My grandmother used to say there's a time for planting and a time for harvest." She meant it literally because she was a farmer, but she also meant it the other way. I said, "Yes." She said, "It's harvest time, Solil." I said, "Yes, ma'am, it is." The second outcome was an invitation to speak at the USDA's Agricultural Innovation Summit in Washington, D.C., which happened 4 months after the magazine. I had applied the previous year and been waitlisted. After the magazine piece, they called and said a spot had opened. I spoke for 20 minutes to an audience that included agricultural policy officials, researchers, large-scale producers, and representatives from the retail sector. I talked about the documentation gap, the traceability problem, what Provenance had built and how. I talked about Theodora without using her name. She had asked me not to, said she didn't need to be named in policy circles. She was a farmer, not a spokesperson, but with enough specificity that anyone in the room could understand what her situation represented as a category. I talked about what happens when the systems designed to certify quality are calibrated only for producers with the administrative capacity to navigate them, and who gets left out when that's the default. After the talk, a woman came up to me. She introduced herself as the deputy director of a USDA office that worked on food systems equity. She said, "Are you familiar with the small producer traceability initiative that's being developed?" I said, in outline, "I've been following it in the regulatory filings." She said, "We've been looking for companies with the operational expertise to help pilot it. Would you be interested in a conversation?" I said, "Yes." That conversation has led to a formal advisory relationship and a pilot project that, if it produces the results we expect, will influence federal guidance on small producer certification. Will, in other words, become part of the infrastructure that prevents the situation that Theodora experienced from being experienced by other producers, at scale, systemically. This is the thing I could not have told my father at the dining room table when I was 23, because I did not know it yet. The business was the means. This, the policy influence, the systemic change, the infrastructure that gets built into the federal guidance and therefore into the market, this was the end I was working toward without knowing exactly what it would look like. I know what it looks like now. I want to tell you about a small thing, because this story has had large things in it, and I believe in small things the way my mother believes in books. as the containers where the important parts of experience live, small enough to hold in your hands, dense enough to carry everything. In the month after the library event, my father started sending me things. Not emails, not calls, things. A clipping from the Baton Rouge Advocate about a new sustainable agriculture initiative in Louisiana. A printout of a regulatory update from the FDA that he had annotated in the margin in red pen, his courtroom markup, the same annotation style I have seen on legal briefs, applied to an agricultural policy document, with the note, "This affects your certification timeline for LA producers. Call me when you've read it." A book, The Unsettling of America * by Wendell Berry. In the front cover in his precise handwriting, "I should have read this 30 years ago. Maybe we can talk about it." A copy of my grandfather's naturalization certificate, my father's father, Chibuzo Ape, who came to the United States in 1971 and who I had heard about but whose formal papers I had never seen. With a note, "He built something from nothing too. I should have said this sooner. It runs in the family." I called him the day the naturalization certificate arrived. I said, "Papa, the certificate." He said, "I found it in the files when I was looking for something else, and I thought you should have it." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're the one who would understand what it means. Tobias, my cousin, his brother's son, who works in banking, Tobias would say thank you and put it in a drawer. You would put it on the wall." I said, "You know me." He said, "I do know you. I have always known you. I have not always shown you that I knew you. That's different." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm working on it." I said, "I know." He said, "The Berry book, have you read it?" I said, "Not yet, it's on my nightstand." He said, "The chapter on the agricultural myth, I'd like to know what you think." I said, "You read it." He said, "I read it twice, once slowly and once with my annotations." I said, "Are you going to send me the annotated copy?" A pause, then, "If you'd like it." I said, "I'd like it." He sent it, I have it. His annotations in red pen, the same marks he makes on legal documents, applied to Wendell Berry's argument about the American relationship with land and labor and the small farmer, and in the margins in several places the note, "Solil's point exactly." Solil's point exactly. My father, 30 years of corporate law, red pen on Wendell Berry in the margins, writing, "Solil's point exactly." I keep the annotated book on my desk, next to the folder of my mother's articles. There is one more person I haven't properly told you about, because I have been working up to her, and she deserves her place at the end of this. Patience Akpe Nwasu, 23, Uncle Ray's youngest, she who sent the photograph of my mother on the kitchen floor with the text, "I think you should know what's happening over here." Patience is, I have been thinking about how to describe Patience properly, and I keep arriving at something that sounds like a cliché until I say it, so I'm going to say it and trust you. Patience is the one who refused to let the wrong story stand. While my parents were telling the version with the failed business and the quiet retreat, Patience was telling anyone who would listen, and some who wouldn't, the other version. She didn't have details, she didn't have evidence, she had only her conviction, which she deployed with a 23-year-old's total absence of the social calculation that makes older people hold back. Mrs. Effon at church, "Actually, Solil's business is going really well, she has investors and clients." My father's golf partner, "I don't know where you heard that, but that's not what's happening." Her mother, who had relayed the wrong story to her, "Mom, you need to stop repeating that because it's not true and it's not fair." She did this without my knowledge. She did it because she believed in me in the specific way of a younger cousin who has watched you her whole life and decided, on the evidence of watching, that you are worth believing in. She did it without being asked, and without receiving any credit for it, and without telling me, because she is 23 and her sense of what the right thing to do is has not yet been complicated by the adult calculation of consequences. I found out about all of it after, when I was putting together the full picture from all the fragments, when I asked her, who knew the right story while the wrong story was circulating. She said, "Me, and I told people." I said, "You told people?" She said, "Yes." I said, "How many?" She said, "I don't know, everyone who said anything to me about it." I said, "Patience, why didn't you tell me what was happening earlier before the magazine? You could have told me." She said, "You were building something. I didn't want you to come home and fight about the story. I wanted you to build the thing and then have the story be impossible to maintain." I said, "That's..." She said, "It's practical." I said, "It's also kind." She said, "Those aren't different things." 23 years old, those aren't different things. I'm going to make sure Patience Aikp Nwasu has every opportunity that comes into my orbit to make use of, because she has the specific quality that matters most in any endeavor worth undertaking. She holds the right story even when the wrong story is easier, and she holds it without making the holding into a performance or a demand. She just holds it, quietly, correctly, until it can hold itself. My name is Solil Aikp. I am 31 years old. I want to tell you the last thing, the thing that happened after all the other things, the thing that is so small that I almost didn't include it, and that I have decided to include anyway, because it is the most true thing in this entire telling, truer than the magazine and the funding round, and the USDA summit, and the Harvest Table partnership. It happened on a Sunday morning in May, 3 months after the library event. I had driven back to Baton Rouge. It had become a monthly thing by then, the Friday evening drive and the Saturday with my parents and the Sunday morning before I drove back. It had become, quietly and without any formal declaration, the new rhythm. Sunday morning, my parents' kitchen. My mother was making akara, bean fritters, the Sunday morning food of my childhood, a food that requires a specific preparation and a specific oil temperature, and a specific attention that my mother applies with the focused ease of someone who has made this thing 1,000 times. The kitchen smelled like the combination of frying oil and the red pepper in the batter, and underneath it the faint ghost of my father's old tobacco, the smell that was always going to be there, that lived in the walls. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, working on a proposal document. My father was at the other end of the table with his Sunday newspaper. He still takes the physical paper, which I find endearing and which he considers simply correct. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window the way it always comes through that window, at a specific angle that hits the table and makes a parallelogram of light that moves as the morning progresses. No one was talking. My mother cooking, my father reading, me working. The sounds of the kitchen, the oil, the morning birds outside, the refrigerator's intermittent hum, the turn of my father's newspaper page. I looked up from my laptop. I looked at the light on the table. I looked at my mother's back, the familiar shape of her at the stove. I looked at my father's face over the top of the newspaper, concentrated on whatever he was reading. I had spent 3 years building a company from a spare bedroom. I had spent 3 years navigating a wrong story told about me by the people who loved me most, and could not, in their fear, fully believe in me. I had spent 3 years learning that the work is the answer to the story, not the refutation of it, not the confrontation with it, but the building of something so real and so documented, and so in the world that the wrong story simply cannot coexist with it. I had cried on the phone with my mother. I had heard my father say for the first time, "I owe you an apology." I had stood in a library in Baton Rouge and said, "My parents gave me the foundation." All of these things were true. All of these things had happened. And now I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, and no one was talking, and the light was moving on the table, and my mother was making akara, and my father was reading the paper, and I was working on a proposal document, and the kitchen smelled like home. I did not have words for what I felt in that moment. I am not sure words are the right form for it. It was not resolution exactly, because nothing about relationships with parents resolves. It is ongoing, it is continuous. It is the thing that is there every Sunday morning and every phone call and every annotated book sent in the mail and every article clipping and every red pen margin note. It was not forgiveness exactly, because what had happened between us was complicated enough that forgiveness is too clean a word for what it required. It was something more like we are here, all three of us, in this kitchen, making our way toward each other, still. My mother turned from the stove and set a plate of akara on the table. She said, "Eat before it gets cold." I saved my document. I closed my laptop. My father folded his newspaper and set it down. We ate. A magazine weighs 8 ounces, half a pound. It can arrive in a mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday and change the weight of a story that has been told incorrectly for a year and a half. It can be carried inside by shaking hands and read twice by a man who has spent 30 years building arguments, and it can make a woman sit on her kitchen floor. in the specific posture of someone whose understanding of the world has just been updated. 8 ounces, the weight of the proof that something you built is real. But here is what I know now, from the other side of all of it. The magazine mattered because of what it represented. It mattered because 32 pages of careful reporting said, "This is real, this exists, this person built this and it stands." It mattered because my mother carried it inside with shaking hands and my father read it twice. It mattered because Mrs. Effon at church finally heard the right story from the right source in the right form. And it also did not matter, not ultimately, not in the way that matters most. What mattered was Theodora Blanchard at her kitchen table on my first visit deciding to trust me. What mattered was Odette's cover letter with no filler. What mattered was Kweku's sketch on the back of a program. What mattered was Vivienne's 3 words. What mattered was Patience at 23, telling the right story to everyone who offered her the wrong one, without recognition and without being asked. What mattered was the annotated Wendell Berry in red pen. What mattered was my grandfather's naturalization certificate. What mattered was the folder of articles in my mother's handwriting. What mattered was my father's hand on my mother's back in the photograph that Patience sent me. What mattered was the kitchen on Sunday morning, the akara, the light on the table, the familiar weight of the people I came from, present and real, making their way toward me as I made my way toward them, none of us having any choice but to keep going, none of us wanting any other choice. I built a company out of a documentation gap, out of the space between what a small producer knows and what the market has the language to recognize. I built a system for making the invisible visible, the informal formal, the known but unproven proven. I have done the same thing, I realize now, with my own life. I have built the documentation, I have built the record, I have built the proof that what was always there was always there. It was always there, I always knew it, I just needed to find the light and the angle and the time. Rooted in the work, in the kitchen on Magnolia Street, in Theodora's fields, in my grandfather's handwriting on a naturalization certificate, in everything that was given and everything that had to be built and everything that is still becoming. Sourced from the people who held the right story when the wrong one was easier, from the ones who drove 2 hours to a library, from the ones who sat on kitchen floors, from the ones who said, "Tell me more." Delivered to you to this telling, to the Tuesday morning mailbox and the shaking hands, and the kitchen floor and the Sunday morning and the akara and the light. This is the story, all of it, real. If you are being told the wrong story about yourself by the people who are supposed to know you best, hold on. Build anyway. The documentation of what you're building is coming. It always comes. And when it arrives at their door, in whatever form it arrives, 8 ounces, half a pound, exactly the weight of the truth, they will know. They will sit with it. They will find you. Keep building until they can.